Somewhere inside a hardened command bunker outside Tehran right now, Iranian air defense officers are staring at radar returns they cannot explain. Objects that fly like Iran's own drones. Objects that use the exact profile Iran itself pioneered and exported to half the region. Except these ones don't behave the way they're supposed to. When Iran's own operators try the tactic that has worked for years, jamming or spoofing the GPS signal to send an incoming drone off course, these ones simply keep flying, straight through the jamming, straight to the target. Because the United States didn't just build a new drone, it built Iran's own weapon, turned it inside out, and handed it back with the one flaw that made Iranian drones so easy to kill removed entirely. That is not speculation. That is the single most significant development to come out of this war in months, and it explains something that has been genuinely confusing analysts since March. How is the United States absorbing wave after wave of cheap Iranian drone and missile attacks at a fraction of the cost defenders usually pay, without its own munitions budget collapsing under the strain? Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what this weapon is, why it represents such a fundamental shift in how this war is being fought, why Iran's entire military doctrine was built around an assumption this weapon just shattered, and why, according to multiple independent reports now, Tehran's own commanders are reportedly scrambling to understand a capability they did not see coming and do not yet know how to counter. Stay with me for all of it, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand this war's technology at a level almost nobody covering it casually actually reaches. Quick note on sourcing before we go further. Everything in this video is built from defense trade publications, CENTCOM's own public releases, and reporting that's cross-referenced across multiple independent outlets covering this conflict daily. Not a single unverified claim run through 5 accounts before it reaches you. I'll be clear throughout about what's confirmed through official channels, what's still being pieced together by outside analysts, and where genuine uncertainty remains. Let's get into it. To understand why this weapon matters so much, you need to understand the actual problem it was built to solve, because this war has quietly become the most important weapons laboratory since the early days of the Ukraine conflict. When the US and Israel opened this war on February 28th with a strike that took out Iran's supreme leader, the retaliation that followed within days was staggering in scale. Hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones launched across the region almost simultaneously. And Iran's approach to that retaliation wasn't subtle. It was volume. Cheap, mass-produced one-way attack drones, the same Shahed-style airframes Iran has exported to Russia and armed groups across the Middle East for years, launched in overwhelming numbers specifically designed to swamp air defense systems that can only track and intercept so many targets at once. Here's the math that should genuinely worry you if you think about it for more than a few seconds. A single one of Iran's cheap attack drones costs a small fraction of what it costs to shoot one down with a modern interceptor missile. Layer that arithmetic across months of sustained drone barrages, and you get a war where the defender, even while winning almost every individual engagement, is quietly bleeding out financially in a way that's completely invisible to anyone just watching intercept percentage headlines. Multiple defense outlets tracking this war have flagged exactly this dynamic. American and Israeli forces have been intercepting the overwhelming majority of incoming Iranian ballistic threats using layered systems like Patriot, THAAD, and Aegis, but those systems are expensive to operate, and their interceptor stockpiles are not limitless or free to replace. This is the quiet, unglamorous problem sitting underneath the entire war, the one that doesn't show up in daily casualty counts, but absolutely shapes what the Pentagon has spent the last several months building in response. And that response has 2 parts, and both of them together are what's actually rewriting the cost equation of this war in America's favor. Let's start with the first one, because it's the direct answer to the drone swarm problem: directed energy weapons. The US military has deployed its Helios and Odin laser systems in this conflict, alongside Israel's own Iron Beam laser system, and all 3 have been used successfully to shoot down Iranian attack drones. Think about what a laser weapon actually changes about that cost equation I just walked you through. A laser doesn't use a missile. It doesn't have a limited stockpile that runs low after a certain number of engagements. As long as the system has power, it can keep firing intercept after intercept at a cost per shot that isn't even in the same universe as a Patriot missile. That single capability, quietly deployed and quietly operating through months of this war, has been one of the primary reasons the drone swarm strategy Iran built its entire doctrine around has not actually bled the United States dry the way Tehran's planners almost certainly expected it to. It's worth sitting with just how long directed energy weapons have been the subject of someday promises in defense circles before you appreciate what it means that they're now operating in an actual sustained shooting war rather than a test range. For decades, laser weapons were the perennial almost there technology, always a few years from being ready for real combat deployment, always limited by power generation, cooling, or atmospheric interference that degraded the beam over distance. What's changed is that systems like Helios have matured enough, and this conflict has run long enough at high enough intensity, that they've moved from demonstration programs into genuine operational use against a real adaptive adversary firing real munitions. That's an enormous milestone that's getting almost no attention outside specialist defense press, buried under headlines about troop casualties and missile strikes, but it may end up being one of the most consequential military technology stories to come out of this entire war once historians look back on it. And layering 3 separate systems, Helios, Odin, and Iron Beam, together, rather than relying on a single platform, tells you something about how seriously this threat has been taken at the planning level. Redundant, overlapping defensive layers are exactly what you build when a single point of failure is considered unacceptable, which makes sense given how much of this war's outcome depends on keeping the drone swarm cost equation from ever tipping back in Iran's favor. But the laser systems, as significant as they are, aren't actually the part of this story that should be making Tehran panic. Because a laser is, at the end of the day, still a defensive tool. It stops what's coming at you. What genuinely rewrites the balance of a war is a weapon that goes the other direction. And that's where the second part of this story comes in. And it's the part almost nobody outside specialist defense circles is talking about yet. The Pentagon has fielded a new unmanned aerial system, publicly referred to as the Low-Cost Unmanned Combat Attack System, LUCAS for short, operating under a unit reportedly known as the Scorpion Strike Task Force. Now here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, and this is the part of the story I promised you at the start of this video. LUCAS was deliberately modeled on Iran's own one-way attack drone designs. Same basic airframe philosophy, same low-cost, mass-producible logic that made Iranian drones such an effective saturation weapon in the first place. The United States essentially looked at the weapon that had been giving it the most trouble for months and asked a simple question: what if we built our own version of exactly this, cheap enough to produce and expend in large numbers, but fix the one weakness that makes Iranian drones killable in the first place? And that weakness is navigation. Iran's Shahed-style drones rely on GPS to find their targets, which means they are vulnerable to the same countermeasure that air defense operators everywhere have gotten increasingly good at over the past 2 years. Jam or spoof the GPS signal, and the drone goes off course, or crashes, or simply gives up. It's the single biggest reason Iranian drone barrages, despite their numbers, have not achieved the level of destruction Tehran was clearly hoping for. LUCAS closes that exact vulnerability. It's equipped with heavily encrypted, military-grade M-code GPS, a next-generation signal architecture specifically designed to resist jamming and spoofing in ways older civilian-grade GPS never could. But here's the layer that actually makes this a genuinely difficult weapon to counter. Even that hardened GPS signal has a backup. If the drone's GPS system is jammed or blocked anyway, despite the encryption, it automatically activates a secondary navigation method called Digital Scene Matching Area Correlation. In plain terms, the drone doesn't just rely on satellites telling it where it is. It carries preloaded imagery of the terrain along its flight path, and compares what its own sensors are seeing in real time against that stored imagery, essentially navigating by recognizing the ground beneath it, the same way a human pilot might recognize a coastline or a mountain range from memory. Jam the GPS entirely, and the drone simply switches to reading the landscape itself to find its way to the target. Think about what that actually means operationally, because this is the detail that should be causing real alarm inside Iranian command structures right now. Iran's entire air defense doctrine, like every modern air defense doctrine, leans heavily on electronic warfare, jamming and spoofing incoming threats rather than physically shooting down every single one, because physical intercepts are expensive and limited in number the same way American interceptors are. Iran has spent years building out exactly that kind of electronic warfare capability, specifically because it works against GPS-dependent munitions. LUCAS was engineered from the ground up to be immune to the primary tool in Iran's own defensive playbook. It's not just a new drone, it's a drone specifically designed to defeat the exact defense Iran has built its strategy around. There's an almost poetic irony buried in how this weapon came to exist, and it's worth spelling out plainly because it tells you something about how modern militaries actually learn from adversaries in real time. Iran spent close to 2 decades perfecting the low-cost, mass-produced attack drone as a strategic equalizer, a way for a country that could never match American air power dollar for dollar to still inflict real damage through sheer numbers and low unit cost. That doctrine worked well enough that Iran exported it, arming groups and allied states across the region with the same basic playbook, and even supplying variants to Russia for use in an entirely different war thousands of miles away. The Pentagon's answer wasn't to outspend that approach with more expensive, more sophisticated interceptors indefinitely. It was to copy the underlying logic that made the original weapon effective, cheap, expendable, mass-producible, and then fix the one component that made it beatable. That's not just a new piece of hardware. That's the American defense industrial base, absorbing a lesson from its adversary faster than its adversary can adapt to losing the advantage that lesson originally provided. This is why reports describing panic inside Iranian command circles make complete sense when you understand the technical details, rather than just the headline. It's not panic over losing a single battle. It's the realization that a core assumption their entire air defense strategy was built on, that jamming GPS neutralizes incoming drone threats, no longer holds against this specific new adversary weapon. That is the kind of discovery that forces a military to rethink years of doctrine in real time in the middle of an active war, which is about the worst possible moment to be doing that kind of fundamental rethinking. I want to pause here for a second, because if this is the kind of technical depth you actually want from war coverage, instead of 15-second clips repeating the same 3 sentences, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. I'm tracking every new capability, every new weapon system, and every strategic shift in this war as it happens, with this exact level of detail every single time. Let's keep going, because there's a second layer to this weapons story that connects directly to one of the strangest, least explained incidents of the entire war. Back in March, there was an attack that genuinely puzzled defense analysts across the board, and I don't think it's gotten nearly the attention it deserves. Iran reportedly struck Diego Garcia, a remote British military base used by the United States, located roughly 2,500 miles from Iran's own borders. 2,500 miles. That's not a regional strike. That's a distance that, if confirmed as an Iranian-origin munition, would represent a genuinely new class of long-range capability that most public assessments of Iran's arsenal simply did not account for before that attack happened. Analysts covering the conflict described it as perhaps the most surprising and mysterious munitions development of the entire war, and the mystery around exactly what weapon was used and how Iran achieved that kind of range has never been fully resolved publicly. Now, here's why I'm bringing that incident back into this conversation. That single strike on Diego Garcia is almost certainly part of why the Pentagon accelerated deployment of both the laser defense systems and Lucas as fast as it did. A military that has just watched an adversary demonstrate an unexpected long-range strike capability against a base thousands of miles from the actual front line has a very different threat model than a military still assuming the fight stays contained to the Gulf region. Every new defensive and offensive capability fielded since that attack, the lasers, Lucas, the accelerated interceptor production, all of it reads differently once you understand it as a direct response to Iran proving its reach was larger than assumed. This is the layered nature of how this war has actually evolved. Each side keeps revealing a capability the other side didn't fully account for, and each reveal forces a doctrinal scramble on the other side. Iran surprised Washington with Diego Garcia. Lucas and the laser network are, at least in part, Washington's answer. And it's worth noting what never happened after that strike, because the absence of a follow-up is almost as informative as the attack itself. Despite the alarm the Diego Garcia incident caused across defense circles, Iran has not repeated a strike at that kind of extreme range since, at least not according to any confirmed public reporting. That could mean several things, none of them mutually exclusive. The specific munition or launch platform used may have been a one-off capability Iran doesn't have in depth. The logistics of striking that far may be difficult to repeat under wartime conditions, or Iran may be deliberately holding that capability in reserve rather than revealing the full extent of it prematurely. Whatever the explanation, the uncertainty itself is precisely the kind of thing that keeps military planners up at night, because you cannot design a defense around a threat you can't fully characterize. Iran hasn't been sitting still on the weapons side either, which is important context for understanding why this war keeps escalating technologically rather than settling into a predictable rhythm. Iranian state media has confirmed combat use for the first time of an upgraded version of its Hajj Qasem missile, a weapon originally unveiled back in 2025 that Tehran now says has an extended range of around 1,100 kilometers. Iranian reporting describes the missile as using solid fuel, with a modified warhead capable of maneuvering specifically to penetrate air defense systems, paired with what Tasnim describes as an advanced navigation system built to counter electronic warfare and strike with precision. Whether every detail of that description holds up under independent scrutiny is genuinely unclear. Iranian state media has strong incentive to overstate its own capabilities for both domestic morale and international deterrence purposes. But the underlying reality that Iran is fielding upgraded, harder-to-intercept missiles for the first time in this specific conflict appears to be accurate across multiple independent defense outlets tracking the war. Solid fuel matters more than it might sound like on the surface. Older liquid-fueled missiles typically need to be fueled shortly before launch, a process that takes time and that satellite and drone surveillance can sometimes catch in progress, giving defenders early warning before a launch even happens. A solid-fueled missile can sit ready to fire for far longer. with far less preparation time visible to anyone watching from above. That single design choice compresses the warning window defenders get before an incoming launch, which matters enormously when your entire defensive doctrine depends on having enough time to cue an interceptor or a laser onto an incoming target before it's too late to matter. Put those two threads together, and you get the actual shape of this war right now, far more interesting than either side's press releases alone would suggest. Iran is fielding missiles specifically engineered to survive, the kind of electronic warfare and layered interception that has been shooting down the majority of its older weapons. The United States is fielding drones specifically engineered to survive the kind of jamming that has been Iran's most effective defensive tool. Both sides are racing to patch the exact vulnerability the other side has been most effectively exploiting in real time in the middle of an active shooting war. That is an extraordinarily unusual dynamic historically. Most wars don't feature this kind of rapid, mutual, mid-conflict weapons evolution. This one does, and it's part of why defense analysts have started describing this as the most significant live combat testing ground for modern military technology since the early years of the war in Ukraine. Let's bring this back to the human cost, because all of this technology exists inside a war that is actively killing people, and that context should never get lost underneath the hardware discussion. American troop fatalities in this war have now reached 17, according to CENTCOM's own confirmed reporting, including one service member killed during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone in northern Iraq, and separate Jordan-based casualties from a distinct Iranian attack that left 2 dead and 1 still listed as missing in action, with unidentified remains later located by U.S. forces. President Trump, addressing the mounting toll directly, said the country felt very badly about the losses, while also affirming his confidence in the service members carrying out the campaign. Those are not abstractions. Every piece of technology discussed in this video exists specifically because real people are dying on both sides of this exchange. And the entire point of a weapon like Lucas, from the Pentagon's perspective, is reducing exactly that kind of American casualty count by making the drone threat cheaper to neutralize before it ever reaches a base where U.S. personnel are stationed. It's worth pausing on that specific casualty, the service member killed during a controlled detonation of a downed drone, because it illustrates a risk that rarely gets discussed alongside the flashier weapon stories. Even a drone that's been successfully intercepted or forced down isn't necessarily safe. Ordnance disposal teams still have to physically approach, assess, and neutralize whatever warhead or explosive payload that drone was carrying, often under significant time pressure and with incomplete information about exactly what they're dealing with. Every intercepted drone still has to end its life somehow. And increasingly in this war, that final step has proven just as dangerous as the initial engagement. It's one of the quieter reasons a defensive technology like directed energy weapons, which can sometimes disable a drone's guidance or propulsion without triggering a full warhead detonation, carries value that goes beyond simply the cost per shot math discussed earlier. And the regional stakes keep widening alongside the technology. Jordan's military intercepted 3 Iranian missiles in a single afternoon, with a 4th landing in a remote area of the country, part of a broader wave of attacks hitting U.S. allies across the Gulf as this latest phase of the war has continued to escalate. Israel, meanwhile, has issued its own explicit warnings independent of anything happening on the American side of this conflict, with senior officials stating plainly that any Iranian attack on Israeli territory will be met with an immediate response, without conditions or dependence on anyone else's timeline. That's a notable statement because it signals Israel retains the ability and the stated willingness to reopen its own direct front in this war on short notice, even while the current phase has been fought primarily along the American-Iranian axis. Every one of these fronts, American, Jordanian, Israeli, is operating with its own separate calculus, its own separate red lines, and its own separate weapons developments, which is exactly what makes a war like this so difficult to predict from the outside. It isn't one conflict. It's several overlapping ones, all connected through Tehran, all capable of escalating somewhat independently of each other. So here's where all of this actually leaves us. And I want to give you the honest strategic picture rather than an overhyped one. The technology story here is genuinely significant. Lucas represents a real, meaningful shift, a weapon purpose-built to defeat the exact electronic warfare doctrine Iran has relied on for years, and the laser defense network has quietly solved the cost exchange problem that Iran's drone swarm strategy was designed to exploit. Combined, these two systems go a long way toward explaining why, despite months of sustained Iranian missile and drone attacks, American forces have not seen the kind of attritional cost collapse that a purely reactive interceptor-based defense would eventually have produced. That is a legitimate, substantial shift in the technological balance of this war, and it's entirely reasonable that reports describe genuine alarm inside Iranian command structures once the implications became clear. But it's worth being precise about what this technology shift does and doesn't mean for the war as a whole. It does not, by itself, end Iran's missile program, And Iran has shown throughout this conflict that it continues developing longer-range, harder-to-intercept weapons of its own, even as older systems get neutralized. What it does mean is that the cost calculus of this war, the thing that ultimately determines how long either side can sustain this level of conflict, has shifted meaningfully in Washington's favor over the past several months, at exactly the moment Iran's own economic position, tied heavily to the fate of infrastructure like its oil export terminals, has become increasingly precarious. A regime already under mounting financial pressure, now discovering that its primary defensive doctrine has a hole a new American weapon was specifically built to exploit, is a regime facing a considerably harder set of choices than it was facing back in February. Before you go, two things I genuinely appreciate. First, if this level of technical breakdown gave you something the surface level coverage isn't, share this with someone who's been trying to follow this war and keeps hitting walls of jargon nobody explains properly. That's the only way content like this actually reaches the people who want it, instead of getting buried under louder, shorter clips. Second, drop your take in the comments. Do you think a technological edge like Lucas and the laser network is actually enough to force Iran toward a real negotiated end to this war? Or does Tehran keep escalating with new missile capabilities regardless of what the US fields defensively? I read every comment, and if this video delivered real value, hit, like so more people trying to understand the actual mechanics of this war, get the chance to see it. Let's close with where things stand. Since this war reignited in February, both sides have been locked in an unusually rapid mutual weapons evolution rarely seen in modern conflict. Iran's drone swarm doctrine, built on volume and low cost, forced the United States to field-directed energy laser systems, Helios, Odin, and Israel's Iron Beam, specifically to break the cost exchange problem cheap drones were designed to create. Separately, and more significantly, the Pentagon has fielded Lucas, a low-cost attack drone deliberately modeled on Iran's own designs, but hardened against the electronic warfare and GPS jamming that Iran's air defense doctrine depends on, giving it a secondary scene-matching navigation system that keeps it on target even when its GPS signal is fully blocked. That single capability directly undermines the defensive assumption Iran's entire air defense strategy has been built around. And it's a major part of why reports describe real alarm inside Iranian command structures as the implications have set in. Iran, for its part, has answered with its own upgrades, most notably an extended-range version of the Hajj-Qasem missile making its combat debut in this specific conflict. 17 American service members have died, confirming just how real the stakes behind this technology race actually are. Jordan continues intercepting Iranian missiles aimed at U.S. allies, and Israel has made clear it retains an independent right to respond to any direct attack on its own territory. This war is no longer just a story about who strikes first. It's a story about which side's weapons engineers can out-adapt the other faster, in real time, in the middle of an active shooting war. And right now, the evidence increasingly suggests Washington is winning that particular race. Stay locked in, because whatever technology gets fielded next in this conflict, I'll be breaking it down in exactly this kind of depth the moment it surfaces.